Last episode, I spoke at length about roads. On this episode of Melbourne Transport Chronicles, we bring you
the public transport system in Melbourne has a rich history, full of interesting tidbits. Over 200 metropolitan train stations, 20 tram routes, and 5 buses serve Melbourne's growing population.
This extensive public transport system is far from perfect, but it makes Melbourne the great city it is today.
But what if I told you there was a report that wanted to get rid of so much of this network?
Today's episode will be all about the Victorian Transport Study of 1980, more commonly known as the Lonie Report. It's quite the story, so strap in.
Up until 1999, public transport in Melbourne and Victoria was run by the government. In 1980, the trains were run by Victorian Railways, trading as VicRail. The trams by the Melbourne and Metropolitan Tram Board, and buses were mostly private. At the time, an astonishing 88% of private trips were made by car.
That's more than half!
The report made no secrets of its plan to eliminate many of the extravagant costs of public transport.
There is so much about this report that I find fascinating, and it gives a unique glimpse into how Melbourne has changed ever since.
There were many big changes the system faced since its inception, and the report begins by detailing many of the big changes that the public transport system faced since World War II. Patronage based on population had fallen from 50% in 1955 to only 15.9% in 1978, a figure not seen since the 19th century.
The report was written in a time of great change, not only for Melbourne's transport systems, but systems all over the world. The feedback I get after any first date is remarkably similar to the criticisms mentioned in the report, namely poor utilisation, declining patronage, ongoing risk, and obsolescent equipment. These are important issues, of course, and well worth raising. For patronage to improve, these need to be resolved.
One of the biggest problems, and one anyone at the time would agree with, was the state of the aging rolling stock, a fancy word for train. The oldest electric trains in Melbourne, the Tate sets, were reaching an average age of 60. Harris sets had asbestos, and sidings had a lack of security, making vandalism a recurring problem.
The rolling stock problem was beginning to be resolved at the time of the report's writing with the introduction of the Hitachi trains, which many of the audience may be familiar with. This ran until 2013. Not too crazy so far. Let's continue reading.
Elimination of the... What? Why? What? The report championed the idea of closing a sizable chunk of Melbourne's train network, which is bad enough. But to suggest the closure of all of the regional railway lines, bar Geelong, is frankly stupid, especially for those not wanting to go to Geelong.
The elimination of some lines did end up happening. Older viewers might remember the Port Melbourne and St Kilda train lines, which were converted to the tram routes 96 and 109 in the late 80s.
The Stony Point line was canned and then returned, but all the other suggestions? Plainly ridiculous.
By carrying out these recommendations, patronage would fall in a death spiral. Roads would be chockers. And as for the lines that survived the sword of Damocles, they would suffer the indignity of being supplemented by buses in off-peak times. Ugh! One of the other major points of the report was about subsidy and advocating for its removal. It doesn't take a genius to realise that the public transport system should not be run like a regular business. Profit should never be the motive. It's there as a public service.
But it goes on. 85% of Victorians who never, or hardly ever, use trains or trams have to pay up so that the other 15% may ride regularly or frequently at well below the cost of travel. That's a novel thought, and a very simplistic view I have trouble believing was written earnestly in a government report.
The well-understood notion of public transport being within walking distance of people's homes was described as a carefully preserved relic of the 19th century. How dare public transport be convenient?
It wasn't just Lonie that was advocating the closure of many services. The beaching cups in the UK were well remembered for closing many train lines. Speaking of the UK, patronage on trains was falling there too at the same time, so blame cannot be squarely laid on Melbourne's system. Many countries saw the rise of the automobile.
All this moaning about public transport was concernedly audacious and All this moaning about public transport was concernedly audacious and impertinent. While many of its critiques were somewhat justified, the report's tone was bordering on sensationalism. The head of the study, Lonie, was a retired executive of General Motors. Funny that. The Lonie Report, however, made one good recommendation: the rationalisation of public transport fares, advocating for a single ticket to be used across train, tram and buses. It's a great idea, and I'm glad it was implemented. It may shock many of you that I'm quite fond of Melbourne's public transport system, and I for one am very glad that many of the report's recommendations were not carried out.
The Lonie Report is something many would look back on as something that was quite short-sighted, and I'd tend to agree with them. The government today is investing in many new railway lines, a fact that is a great repudiation of the report's central findings.
Melbourne is a great city because of its public transport system, not in spite of it. Like the Collingwood Football Club, it had many flaws. Next time you're in Melbourne, take some time to appreciate the magic of the train, tram and bus systems. That's the end of another episode. Thank you so much for watching. If you want some more, click here to see my video all about freeways. Until next time.